Hi, my name is Dodge Landisman, and this is my third video. I'm a student at Emerson College in graduate school for journalism, and I've been going to New Hampshire to really track down these candidates because I think when you examine them, voters are so used to getting maybe 1 to 2 to 3 minute clips of what these candidates are saying, but they really don't get to the heart of their message, to the meat of their message. And I think it's important, in addition just to playing these clips, is to exhibit the entire speech of what these candidates are saying when they come and they take their case to the people of New Hampshire. So I've already done 2 videos, Tulsi Gabbard as well as Kirsten Gillibrand, so you're welcome to check those out. This video is about Cory Booker and his house party out in Manchester, New Hampshire this past Sunday. I should start off by saying I'm quite a big fan of the senators. I think he's incredibly dynamic, incredibly likable, and he kind of has that it factor that just makes him more human, more relatable, I think, than the average candidate. If you've been following him, you might have seen his history. He once ran into a burning building to save a constituent who was in a fire. He personally shoveled somebody's snow who addressed him on Twitter and said that their block needed snow shoveling in the middle of a snowstorm. So Cory Booker is that accessible president who has gone out. He still lives in a low-income community in Newark. He hasn't left. He's the only senator, I think, that's really lives on the ground with the neediest people. And I think that's so rare, and that's incredibly new in an elected official. Yes, many presidents have come from modest means in the past, certainly, but at some point they graduate to a more comfortable living, to a more safer, quote-unquote, safer neighborhood, to a more, quote-unquote, desirable neighborhood, and they don't live on the ground. And there's always at least a minimum of 10-year separation. Even Bernie Sanders, I love him to death, but he has the lake house, he's a little more isolated, doesn't necessarily live in downtown Burlington, for example. So I think Cory Booker going to sleep and waking up each single day with his neediest constituents says so much about his character, and says that he is willing to talk to anybody who wants him to listen. So one of the issues about Cory Booker that people have is they think he's sort of this economic conservative, that he's essentially subservient to big business, to big corporation, and of course to big pharmacy. And one of the reasons people say that is because there was this vote on legislation that would have made medication cheaper. You'd be able to get it from Canada, and therefore it would have saved a lot of lives. It would have addressed healthcare and made that process much easier. And Cory Booker voted against it. And it was a bill that looked like it had bipartisan support. Mostly Democrats were supporting it. A good handful of Republicans were also supporting it. So I will admit, and I will acknowledge, that his vote certainly made a difference in the passage of that legislation. But I think, again, you have to examine what type of politician Cory Booker is. First and foremost, Cory Booker is a people's politician. And so many, of course, are the people's politician in terms of what they believe in terms of legislation. But I think Cory Booker is the people's politician in the most practical way possible. He always addresses the needs of constituents. He lives alongside them, and he recognizes a big industry within his state, especially within the city of Newark, the city for which he once served as mayor very effectively, has a big pharmaceutical industry. It has a lot of pharmaceutical companies occupying those buildings, creating jobs within the city of Newark, also elsewhere within the state of New Jersey, and has been a big economic advantage to the state of New Jersey. So I think when Cory Booker made that vote, he felt, yes, he wants to move forward with healthcare. He wants to make it more subsidized. He wants to make medication cheaper. But at the same time, he wants to make sure that his constituents don't lose their jobs, don't lose their livelihood, don't lose their income. And to me, because of that, and that's the reason he gave, with his eye on his constituents, I sort of give him a pass. On other issues, he's been a little less pro-regulation. I'm personally a more libertarian, leaning progressive. I think that's a very good thing. And it's weird to refer it to this way, but we need somebody to continue the Obama-Trump economy. The economy improved significantly under the Obama years, and it has steadily improved under the Trump years. And I think, I must admit, both of their approaches, both President Trump and President Obama's approaches to the economy have been effective. So I think if we have somebody who has more of an eye on income inequality, which I think Booker does, but also has a respect for business and also wants to raise corporate taxes, but is wary of how much, and wants to create this change incrementally so residents of the United States can keep on to their jobs, so industry can still be here. I think that's very much a good thing. And I think it's a good thing to say, hey, I don't necessarily need to follow the party orthodoxy in terms of economic issues. I think that also makes him a lot more viable in a general election. If he's a one candidate saying, hey, I'm going to have similar policies to the president, except I'm going to address income inequality, and I am going to be more progressive on healthcare, and I am going to be more progressive on a whole host of issues, then I think that's that perfect blend. Let's continue this success. Let's continue that low unemployment rate, but then let's finally address this really large income gap and see how we can bring both sides to the table, the table of the business community, which is an important part, and the table, of course, of the community fighting for income and for a livable wage and for a viable life. And so there's somebody who speaks both languages and could bring both people to the table. They could bring union leaders to the table. They could bring corporation executives to the table. I think that would make for an effective president, because then we would finally see meaningful legislation be passed. You know, I admire Bernie Sanders. I admire the more economically progressive candidates in the race, but I wonder, even if we do have enough money to pay for all these things, will they be effective with Congress? Even if Congress is majority Democrat, I can guarantee you that there's a strong segment of the Democrats that cannot afford to be nearly as progressive as AOC, for example. They're just different districts. They're in the Midwest. They're more rural. They might be suburban, whatever it might be. You really have to think about who are the type of people that are going to be in Congress, who is going to work with this new president, and what is this president's history with working with Congress in the past? And Booker is that ultimate bridge builder. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to reflexively antagonize Republicans all the time. Of course, when they're wrong, which I think is the majority of the time, and I think Mr. Booker would agree with that, then you should antagonize them and you should speak truth to power. And I don't think Booker is shy to do that. And the reason I know he's not shy to do that is because he is the primary candidate out of all the other candidates running. Some of them have unique issues. A lot of them don't. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, is anti-foreign intervention. Cory Booker is Mr. Criminal Justice Reform. And if you're really looking at legislation that has bipartisan support, that will change the trajectory of this nation for the next century to come, I mean, that's really consequential, concrete change, then Booker is that person. And not only that, but he's fully supportive of recreational marijuana. So if you're really looking for somebody to end the prison industrial complex and who's openly speaking about it and who has enacted legislation and passed legislation in the past to address this, Booker has the perfect record. And I really see the mandatory minimum sentencing laws being struck down under a Booker presidency. I really see marijuana being descheduled as a dangerous drug under the Booker presidency. And I really see the disproportionate incarceration rate, not only of young men of color in proportion to white men of color, but also the United States incarceration rate in proportion to other comparable nations. The incarceration rate is astronomically higher than it is in Canada, for example, than it is in Western European countries. And he is the only one that is openly talking about this issue. And to me, that gives him that automatic credibility, because criminal justice reform is an issue that you can realistically pass in Congress. You can realistically pass if you are an effective president who knows how to bring both people to the aisle. And then you could also get support from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Not to mention, this credibility in his record will also make him very attractive in the general election. You know, yes, people talk about the income gap and a lot of other things, but if you look at criminal justice reform, that's a lot more easy to understand if you're a young man of color or even a young woman of color, how your life would be impacted the next day should a new president come in. If they have a policy to address these issues, then I think that inspires you to come out to vote. There are very few people, I think, that are directly speaking to candidates, to voters of color. Yes, so many candidates are saying, I am a person, or I am a woman, or I am a minority, and therefore I share your experience, like Kamala Harris, for example, which is something that should be admired, and there's nothing wrong with making the argument. But how many of them have said, I've created concrete legislative change to address your issues, to make sure that your children, yourself, your family are not reflexively locked up by power-hungry police? Cory Booker has that record and is the one that is constantly talking about this on the campaign trail. And again, we have to find people who are not afraid to challenge the system. Everybody says Cory Booker is so much in bed with the system. But when you challenge the prison industrial complex. You're challenging a lot of potential donors. You're making a very risky choice. So everybody says Cory Booker is a safe guy. He's the establishment guy. I don't think so at all, because I think he pissed off a lot of potential funders by really making criminal justice reform his principal cause within the Senate. Finally, I'd like to analyze Cory Booker's speaking style. So I talked about why I think he's good on paper, why he's good on policy, but I want to talk about how he presents to voters, because that's equally as important. Yes, it's important to have somebody who aligns with your personal beliefs and who could guide this country in a progressive fashion, in an effective fashion, but we also need somebody who can beat Trump and who can be elected, of course. And Cory Booker, in my opinion, has the goods. It was a packed house, hundreds of people there. He could barely fit. That's why the early shots of his speech were not as good, and then he started answering questions. The room got a lot smaller, and I got much better shots, but his audio is perfect, so you can hear what he has to say, and you can hear how he presents. And so many people compare Cory Booker to Obama, which is kind of interesting. Of course, the visual comparisons are obvious, which is not a legitimate way to compare somebody to begin with. And yes, he shares Obama's charisma, but I think he's different than Obama, because Obama was always he had the soaring oratory. Obama had the soaring oratory, but he was very kind of cool and collected. Cory Booker has this passion that I have seen in so few politicians, even in so few candidates. Not only does he have soaring oratory, but he can kind of scream at the top of his lungs when he's talking about healthcare reform, when he's talking about supporting our immigrants and supporting our refugees, and he gets the entire room fired up. He creates this sense of urgency where what he's talking about is beyond politics, but it addresses human life and human decency. And his outrage, his deep outrage that I think he feels in his heart, is perfectly and adequately expressed amongst voters. So in a general election, he's that guy that is going to have that energy that can match kind of Trump's bravado and Trump's strength with equal passion. And I think that's so fundamentally important, that people feel like you believe what you're saying, you have the goods to back up what you're saying, and you get excited about what you're saying. And Cory Booker gets excited about his vision. And again, I think that's very rare in these candidates. Yes, many of them are amazing speakers, but there's just something particularly captivating about Booker. He'd be amazing in a debate. He'd be able to challenge Trump effectively, with confidence, with energy, and I think that's what we need. I think Cory Booker is one of the most viable candidates. There's this charisma and energy when he gives a speech that fires up the whole room. He sets it up to a louder decibel than most other candidates would, and he knows how to get people to pay attention. That's incredibly important. He's not just a soaring orator, he's an inspirational orator, and that's very crucial. He has more of a moderate record, which I think will make him incredibly palatable in the general election, and he has a legislative record to back up what he fights for. So you put those things together and you look at, okay, is he going to actually inspire Black Americans who are looking for meaningful criminal justice reform, even Hispanic Americans who are looking for criminal justice reform? Is he going to inspire young people who are looking for recreational marijuana? And I think the answer is yes. And I think because of that, he is one of the strongest candidates to beat Trump, because so many people stayed home last time. Cory Booker with marijuana, with criminal justice reform, those are two huge issues that will bring so many more people out, at least the 3 to 4% who stayed home in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and others that were largely from more minority communities who didn't feel like Hillary, with her record and her communication style, were necessarily speaking to them. So we have the potential to elect a candidate that could finally do that. So I hope we do. Cory Booker's in my top 5. And stay tuned for more.
I am not leaving quickly. I will stay here and take every selfie that you want. And when we do the Q&A, if you're not in my eyesight and I don't call on you, I'm willing to answer questions afterwards. But I do want to say this. This is what gives me faith. Not in my candidacy or that you're here for me. It gives me faith in us and who we are. We share this common history. We have had ugliness in our past. We have had hate in our past. Entire political parties, like the Know-Nothings, rose up in this country's history with bigotry at their core, anti-immigration at their core. We are not a great nation because we were bereft of these things. We are a great nation that in the face of these things, we responded with more unity. We responded with more grace. We responded with a firm commitment to the ideals of this country: liberty, justice for all. Yep. And when people start to doubt who we are, start to lose faith in us, start to feel as if the forces tearing us apart are stronger than those holding us together, then we have a crisis in our country. I worry that we are now indulging in a politics that's pitting us against each other. It's putting one American against another, where the politicians think they can ascend by demeaning and degrading some Americans in order to try to capture higher offices in our land. I'm running for president because I do not believe these things. I'm running for president because I have a great faith that the history of this nation is a perpetual testimony to the achievement of the impossible when we come together and work together and stand together, not despite our differences, but because we know that when we bring different people together from all corners of the planet Earth with common commitment and common cause, there's nothing we can't achieve. And so this is a moral moment for me. And it's much bigger than an office. Y'all, it is a dissatisfaction we should all have that we live in a nation where children across this country, in red states and blue states, Republican children, Democratic children, often find it easier to find unleaded gasoline than unleaded water. That we live in a nation that folk who are being churned into a criminal justice system, a system that teaches you better, as Brian Stevenson says, if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. That we have folks in this country, senior citizens from all backgrounds, who wallow below the poverty line, struggling for human dignity that they deserve. We have a nation right now that people are putting aside their life-saving drugs or their medical care because they can't afford it. These problems are not bigger than us. We can deal with them, but we've got to get back to recognizing that we have a common pain, and we've got to refocus on that sense of common purpose. And so this campaign can't be about just one office. It has to be about all of us, because every issue I just talked about was going on before Donald Trump was elected. Think about that for a second. Everything I just talked about was going on before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. I'm not saying that what he's doing isn't moral vandalism, that he's not hurting people, that his policies from the EPA to the Department of Education are hurting Americans. But if we as Democrats especially make it about him and not about us, or make it about one office and not the cause of our country, we're making a very big mistake. We can't define ourselves by what we're against as a nation. We have to define ourselves with a bigger vision about what we're for. And the activism and the engagement that we've seen over the last 2 years can't cease when one person leaves office. Or then so many of the issues that are plaguing our democracy will not be addressed because it needs more democracy, more engagement. The opposite of justice is not always injustice. It's most often apathy, indifference, and inaction. And so I'm running this campaign not just because of the quality of my ideas or the policies that I want to push. Those are really important, and I hope in the Q&A we get to a lot of those. But understand this, if you're leaving here, please understand the spirit and the energy that I'm trying to push in this campaign is a call for a revival of civic grace, a more courageous empathy in our country, for more of us to act and engage in the cause of our country, which is to fight injustice, to establish more fairness, to create a country that works and elevates humanity in a way that we become even more of a light unto other nations. But let me make this very personal. And when I say personal, it's not just me and my story. Everybody here in this overly full house. When I was growing up, my parents never let me forget how I got the blessings that I get. It wasn't just because of their personal actions and their grit and their self-reliance. They let me understand that the blessings that I had were paid for well before I was born by the sacrifices and struggles. But this is how they basically told the story, because when I was a baby in 1969, just born, and my parents were looking for housing in northern New Jersey, in some of the best areas with the best public schools. They were trying to find homes, but every time they would show up at the house, the real estate agent would see this black family and tell them, "Oh, I'm so sorry, this house has been pulled off the market," or "I'm so sorry, this house has been sold." And my parents felt they were being discriminated against, and they went to this great group of people who looked a lot like the folks in this house. And they said, I'm sorry, this is our America. This is not who we are. We're not going to sit on the sidelines of history. We're going to do something to make a more perfect union. And they said, we're going to help you. So they rallied together to help my family buy a home. And this is what they did. They joined with some lawyers and set up a sting operation. And when my parents would go to a house and be told it was sold already or pulled off the market, they would leave and a white couple would come along, posing as home buyers, and find that the house was still for sale on the house that I grew up in. My parents went to go look at the home. They were told it was sold. They left and the white couple came, found out the house was still for sale. They put a bid on the house. The bid was accepted. Papers were drawn up. A closing was set. And on the day of the closing in the real estate agent's office, the white couple did not show up. My father did. And a volunteer lawyer, this great man who happened to be white, walked in with my dad, and we imagined that he prepared the whole night for this great moment. That he probably rehearsed his speech in violation of federal foul housing law and the values of America, but he didn't get a chance to give his speech. Because as soon as the real estate agent realized he was caught, he didn't give up. He stood up and punched my dad's lawyer in the face. And then he sicked a dog on my dad. And let me tell you right now, every time my dad would tell this story as I was growing up, the dog would get bigger. Eventually it was, boy, I had to fight a pack of wolves to get you in his house. And imagine this. I'm an 18-year-old elected to be president of my class in high school, all-American football player in high school, on my way to Stanford. So yes, I got into Stanford because of a 4.0, 1,600, 4.0 yards per carry, 1,600 receiving yards. My dad would look at me and say, boy, don't you dare ever walk around this house like you hit a triple. You were born on third base. Yeah, go out there to college, but remember, you're going to rack up degrees. You'll have more degrees in the month of July, but you're not hot. Because life ain't about the degrees you get. It's about the service that you give. You owe a debt. This very home you're living in, you owe a debt. Not to the who was president or who was a senator. You owe a debt to ordinary Americans who made an extraordinary commitment on the cause of this country. And you can't pay it back. You got to pay it forward. And so I decided with my life, I'd start as a housing advocate for people who did not have housing rights being honored. And I moved into one of the toughest neighborhoods in our country where people said you couldn't solve these problems. Places that people told you to stay away from, don't walk there. But no, we're Americans. We take on the toughest problems. And I went to the Central Ward of Newark, and I joined together with other people. People of dignity, people of grace, people of beauty. And we started working together. We took on the slumlord, the projects I moved into. Got convicted in federal court. They got me into politics. And I ran for office to lead a city that was in crisis. 60 years of losing population, losing investment. Newark sailing through the worst economy of my lifetime, and we were able to create the biggest economic development period in our cities, 60 years in our city. Take our schools from failing to now the #1 school system in America for beat the odds schools, high poverty, high performance. Our first youth courts and drug courts and veterans courts in our state. We opened up entire city blocks to urban farming, got supermarkets in the neighborhoods to banish food deserts, created tremendous change. But it's not the story of a leader, it's a story of a people. I believe there's nothing we can't do, and I went to Washington to try to combat cynicism about even Washington. As Craig said generously in his introduction, we took on problems, again, that people weren't talking about enough, people said couldn't be solved, like the criminal justice system, which is a cancer on the soul of this country. Any nation that professes like we do to be the land of the free, but then incarcerates more people on the planet Earth than any other one, that's a hypocrisy. 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth is right here in America. And we were told we couldn't do anything with it. And then I get to the Senate, and makes matters worse is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, I could write a dissertation on our disagreements. And he literally was standing on the floor arguing against my bill. We ended up building a bill that got out of our committee, that failed to get passed under Obama, but we didn't give up. We kept going. Now we passed that bill that is liberating thousands of Americans, one of whom I took to the State of the Union address, who was given a life sentence for crack cocaine weighing less than a baseball. I'm telling you right now, I am fired up. I believe in our country. I believe in us. Don't let anybody tell you it's impossible that every American can have access to quality health care. Don't let anybody tell you it's impossible that every child can find a school that's a cathedral of learning. Whether you're a beautiful child with a disability or whether you're a child in an inner city, everybody in America can have great schools. Don't tell me we can't have a nation in which every child has a birthright, has access to clean air and clean water. Don't tell me that we can't restore dignity to work. That everyone who's willing to work a full-time job can raise a family, can have a career path, can retire with dignity and security. Don't tell me what we can't do, because I know our history. We defeated Jim Crow and the Nazis. We found a way to go to the moon and map the human genome. We did these things not because of rugged individualism or self-reliance. I love those themes in our country. But the way we did those things was we did them together. American to American, reaching out across the lines that divide us, because they're nowhere near as strong as the ties that bind us. And so I'm running for president not just to win an office, but there's a larger campaign for our country. Our nation is a moral moment. We are at a crossroads that is going to define who we are. We all have to accept the responsibilities that we are framers again. That we have to reestablish the ideals of this country in this generation. That this nation needs our civic grace. It needs our empathy. It needs our real definition of patriotism. Because what is patriotism? Love of country. And you cannot love your country unless you love your fellow countrymen and women. I reject this idea that some people tell me, well, we're a nation of tolerance, as if that's somehow what your party label is. Heck, millennial Americans, if you're Republican or Democrat, you want common sense gun safety. Millennial Americans, whether you're Republican or Democrat, are tired of seeing people getting crushed by student debt. Millennial Americans, whether you're Republican or Democrat, believe that senior citizens should have dignity in their retirement, and believe that we need to do something about climate change. We have common values, folks, and have a lot of common pain, but we've got to get back to that common purpose, and that's how I want to end. There's a second half to that story I told you already, and it stunned me. You see, I go to the Senate and get to work, and I decide to write a book called United. And if you have a daddy like mine, when you're writing a book about your past, you got to fact check stuff. I mean, was it a pack of wolves or a dog? And so I find the head of the Fair Housing Council from the 1960s. She was easy to find. Her name's Ms. Lee Porter. She is 92 years old and still the head of the Fair Housing Council. And now she doesn't represent black families. She represents Muslim families and same-sex couples and Americans with disabilities, because she believes firmly that justice is justice. It has no color, no orientation, no religion. There's one justice in America, and that's American justice. And I talked to her, and she said, go find the lawyer that organized it all, Cory. She can confirm all the stories, including the size of the dog. And so I find this guy. His name's Arthur Lessman. He's now a retired judge in New Jersey. Back then, he was a young man just starting out. Anybody here who started a business can imagine how busy he was in the 1960s, starting a business, tired, working hard, trying to raise a family. And I listened to his story. I called him up. I'm Cory. I know who you are. I go, well, sir, I don't know what you know. If you know what you did for my family, I know what I did for your family. I'm like, sir, well, I want to thank you. And he gave me all the facts. He confirmed all the parts of the story. It was not a pack of wolves, for crying out loud. And then I asked him the question that floored me. I asked him why. Why would you, at a time that you were busy, the time that you were working hard, trying to start a business, at a time that there was fear about black people moving into neighborhoods and property values going down and white flight, why would you take so much time to help black families moving into your community? And this is what his answer was. He says, Cory, I remember the moment I made the decision. I go, the moment? He goes, I know exactly what I was doing. What were you doing? I was watching TV. And unlike me, some nights, where I'm watching Rachel, and I get caught up in a state of sedentary agitation. She gets me so upset some nights. And sometimes I find myself saying to the TV, somebody should do something about that. And then I realize, you're a United States Senator. No, he wasn't like me in sedentary agitation. He was watching TV. And this is back, y'all, some people in this room remember, not everybody, when we had like 3 channels. And you all remember at 11 o'clock, they would like play the national anthem, and it'd be done, no more TV. It's probably why we had higher birth rates back then. My staff hates when I make that joke. He's watching TV and they have breaking news. Something now every 10 seconds on CNN. Breaking news. Melania has a jacket. But this is rare. It rarely happened. But they broke away from the movie he was watching. What movie was he watching? A movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. Most of America's watching this show about the Holocaust and the aftermath. And the show gets cut into because the cameras go to a bridge in Alabama. You see, these marchers started marching from Selma, and we're trying to get to Montgomery. Why? Something we know about right now. So they could vote. Voters' rights. But they get stopped on that bridge, confronted by Alabama state troopers, and he's watching on a couch in New Jersey, and these state troopers confront them. The marchers decided to turn around. They were going to do a short prayer and turn around. How do I know that? Because I talked to one of those marchers, who's now one of my colleagues and friends, one of my heroes, a man named John Lewis. And Congressman Lewis, definitely applaud for him. Congressman Lewis says he was about to get down on his knees to pray with his fellow marchers, 600 fellow Americans, but yet before they could even get onto their knees, they get gassed. And then the state troopers storm in with billy clubs, savagely beating the marchers. John Lewis humbly says to me, he goes, Cory, I shed a little bit of blood on that bridge. And I looked at him and said, Congressman Lewis, you had your head cracked open. You were knocked unconscious. You bled profusely on that bridge. Those marchers on that day got driven back. And that man on that couch in New Jersey saw what was happening and got up. And he didn't allow his inability to do everything to undermine his determination to do something. He couldn't afford a plane ticket. He couldn't close his business. But he was going to do the best he could with what he had, where he was. One American got up, started making phone calls, found a woman named Miss Lee Porter who was like, hallelujah, thank you, Lord. I need some help. He then went on a little bit of pro bono work. He started organizing other lawyers to do the same. And soon, one American to another, they had a great force of folks. And he told me 4 years later, he gets a case file with 2 names on it, Carrie and Carolyn Booker, my parents. Now think about this chain reaction. The world by making a change in their locality, in their community. We don't curse the darkness in this country. We light candles. We are a nation that has shown that in the face of hatred and bigotry, we can bring love and healing. And this is that moral moment again in our country. We won't be called to do marches in front of state troopers willing to beat us. We won't be called to do some of the courageous things of our ancestors, whether Alice Paul and hunger strikes or people marching beaches. But this is our moment, and how will we define the character of our country? Because you cannot campaign wrong and think you're going to govern right. What will we do, and what will we say over these moments? Will we revive civic grace? Will we ignite a more courageous empathy? Will we stand for love? Because you cannot lead the people if you don't love the people. If we stand like that and work like that and come together and confront injustice like that, the injustice of poverty, lack of health care, lack of jobs with dignity, lack of retirement with dignity, if we confront those problems together, I promise you our tomorrows will be better than our yesterdays. I promise you that we indeed can make justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I promise you that we as a nation will rise. Thank you, everybody. So for those, I'll repeat this one more time. It is an amazing question that there are some teachers and retired teachers in this room, I promise you, that are thinking to themselves, I can't believe we are still dealing with issues like this. But we have had a butchering of basic constitutional principles in this country. A butchering of. We have a Justice Department that's not defending ideals of justice. We have a president that is encroaching on the powers of the Congress. And when I say that, I'm not even talking about this president. I want to tell you the complaints I've had about this idea that we are conducting a 17-year war that has us engaged in places like Yemen, all under the authorization of military force from 2001, 2002. And now we have a president that wants to declare national emergency and then go play golf. Who literally says as he's signing the national emergency that, oh, I could have done this now, I could have done this later. I mean, this is an encroachment that even Republicans are speaking out against. So look, I love the Constitution. It was an imperfect document. I think that Stokely Carmichael used to always say constitu. I can only say 3/5 of the word. But the truth of the matter is, we are a nation that has improved upon that document and made it better. Look, there are things about the Electoral College I just don't like and think are undemocratic. So right now, we need to elect people that will respect the separation of powers. But this is also an issue, back to your beginning of your question, about civics and all of us understanding our role in a democracy. We have allowed forces to corrupt our democracy like big money in our politics that are just wrong. It's one of the reasons why and I'm happy to hear other people do it now, are to that point. You can't campaign wrong and think you're going to govern right. I'm not taking PAC money, corporate PAC money. I'm not taking federal lobbyist money. I'm not taking pharma exec money. We want to show that you can run a campaign that's powered by the people so that we can get some of these forces out. But I will be a president that respects the separation of powers, respects the power of the judiciary, tries to appoint people to executive positions and judicial positions that also share the same values. Right? Yes?
Thank you for sharing the message. We appreciate that in Hampshire. I would like to know if you are taking any NRA money.
How do I feel about Medicare for all? So first and foremost, let's get to our common values. That every American agrees that we should not have people who put aside life-saving drugs or treatment because they can't afford it. You cannot have our founding principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you do not have access to health care. And not having access to health care has created these things in our country that should be morally objectionable to us all. We have the highest infant mortality rates of industrial nations and the highest maternal mortality rates in the industrial world because people are not getting access to adequate health care before they give life to this country. We know that's morally unacceptable. And so the question is what do we do about it? And my firm belief is that we need to get us to a system where everyone has access. That's why I signed on to the Medicare for All bill. But I'm not going to be one of these presidential candidates that's not going to tell you the hard truth. The hard truth is we're going to need 60 plus votes in the Senate to get that done. And don't tell me we can't get 60 plus votes in the Senate. I can show you pathways to get there, but it's going to be hard. And if we're not, I was a former mayor, and I hope my fellow mayor here, I can get a hallelujah amen from her. When you go to the supermarket and people tell you about a problem, they don't want to hear your philosophy. They want to say, how are you going to make my life better? And so if we don't get that 60 votes, we've got to be ready to take the pathways that we can get as much off the table as we can. Let me give you an example. Medicare for all is great, but if we can't get that, but if we can extend Medicare down to age 55 and have eligibility for 55-year-olds and older, that's going to create such an effect on the whole system that's going to make it better. For example, you give security to people who are 55 and above, and you also take the pools that are out there in private insurance markets and you make them healthier. And therefore you lower costs for everybody. Whoever the Democratic nominee is and the next president is, and God willing, I'll be that person, they need to come hard with what I call the affordability crisis. that people in America who are low income, working class, middle class, we're all struggling with costs that are just outrageous. From childcare to college, from prescription drugs to the copay. And in medical care, we create a system that is so much more expensive because by people waiting to see a doctor, we now have a system that treats disease and illness as opposed to preventing it or early interventions. What is it going to do to our economy? What's it going to do to our freedom? And they start telling all the reasons why we can't do this bold thing to face up to our planet in peril. In fact, I just think if this happened around John F. Kennedy's time, when he said we're going to go to the moon, suddenly people started saying, wait, we can't do that. It's going to cause this. Oh my God, it's government controlling our lives and all of this stuff. No, we need to have a bold vision because climate scientists are talking about the peril to our planet and how the timelines are accelerating as we see the acidification of our oceans, as we see the melting of the polar ice caps, the permafrost being exposed, more carbon coming into our systems. And so your question is pragmatically, Cory, what can we do in the Green New Deal? Well, one more step before I get there. When I was mayor, I faced the same issues. Epidemic asthma rates in my city. We were heat islands, and I told my city that we can do the right thing and create win-win-wins for our city. So what did we do? We environmentally retrofitted every building we could. And what did we do? We lowered the energy costs for taxpayers. What did we do? We actually created jobs for my young people. We had apprenticeship programs for solar roof installations, and we made our environment more healthy. That was a win-win-win-win. There are so many things we can do as a nation that follow in that same line. From not letting other nations like the Chinese beat us in green innovation and the jobs of the future, we can double down on our investments, and we already know for things like DARPA-E and others that these programs we invest in, we get $2, $3 in return for future economic growth. We can make sure that we create the right kind of incentives for renewable energies. The renewable energy, whether it's geothermal, solar, they don't have the same tax treatment as fossil fuel energy does. There are so many things that we can do to provide for a green future that we're not doing. And the last thing, we could lead again, not just lead in the ways I talked about, but heck, we only produce 14% of the planet's carbon greenhouse causing gases. And if we pull away from other countries and stick our head in the sand, remember, there's only one major political party on the planet Earth that denies climate science, and that's the American Republican Party. That was just raised 500% because somebody bought that drug and thought they could jack the prices up. We have folks that are, I can go through the horror stories, mental health drugs and more. And so what is the solution to this? And actually, these aren't kind of crazy solutions. These are things that other countries are doing. And for me, I put forth pieces of legislation time and time again, partnering with some of my colleagues. You know, Senator Sanders and I and Senator Casey have a bill for importing drugs from Canada, which is your neighbor to the north. But let me give you two other things we should do that are just common sense. One is using the power of Medicare to negotiate better prices could drive down prices dramatically. Number two is creating a legitimate stick. What do other countries do to make sure that their nation's drug prices aren't in line with other global competitors? Well, my senior senator, who just won his re-election, was running against a pharmaceutical executive and was exposed to one of his critical cancer drugs, was one price in this nation and a fraction, same drug, same producers, was a fraction in Russia of what it cost in this country. And so what other nations do is they have a stick that if you raise prices above what's being charged in the mean or average of other countries, there's a real consequence. I have a bill that I've sponsored that would literally say if you do that, you lose your patent, your exclusivity, and generics can come in and undercut your prices. So we have solutions to this problem. I'm bringing to the floor as a senator, and I will lead them to fruition should I be president of the United States. It doesn't mean that there's not a cancer on the soul of this country. The cancer may not be in my part of the body politic, but it's threatening the body as a whole.
I've got mine, I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. That is not the American way. I got mine, you go get yours. The American way says we're all in this together. Okay? Oh, they handed me something. And then they say, people can't hear in the back. And they're starting to leave. Don't leave. And then, so wrap your questions up. Why don't we do two more questions? I'm sorry. We're gonna do three more questions. Two from the ladies on the couch, and I'm gonna pick a young man. This young man here. Okay, does that sound fair? What's your question real quick? Just tell it to me and I'll answer it at the end.
The opioid epidemic.
Opioid epidemic.
Yes.
Hold that.
Okay.
So we're going to go ladies on the couch first. Okay. Opioid epidemic. Look, this is common pain, common purpose. I live across the street from a drug treatment center. You know, in my city, they often call them junkies. We're treating opioid epidemics in the most expensive ways. Hospital emergency rooms and jails. That is not the way to deal with this problem, especially when there's evidence-based interventions that can drive down opioid addiction rates, as well as deal with relapses after people have had overdoses. There are evidence-based things that work. This is not a matter of can we address this crisis, it's a matter of having that collective will. When the Senate passes big pieces of legislation to deal with it and then doesn't authorize funding for it, that's insulting the people on the front lines struggling with this issue. I have a commitment to this that's been seen by me working in New Jersey in ways that aren't even in accordance to my job as a senator, and I will lead on this issue should I be President of the United States.
Long-term care is successful.
Long-term care is very successful. So is peer-to-peer treatment when people show up in the emergency rooms. I can go through what I know that works. I'm telling you right now, not a matter of can we, it's where is our will as a people to address this problem, not with words, not with thoughts and prayers, but with actual real investment in things that actually work, okay? So I've signed on before to a constitutional amendment that was done by Senator Udall. I'll look at this one. I agree with you 100% that we need to get the money out of politics. This idea from Citizens United that corporations are people is offensive to people. All right. There was one more question on the yes.
You got me fired up. I was not going to say anything, but I'm a paraprofessional in the Manchester School District, and I want to know, it's a two-part question. I don't feel like we're investing in our future in this city because I work with the kids who are traumatized, and they are, and they're stuck in a vortex of poverty, and I love these kids, but I just don't see anything but jail for them coming up. And why don't I get paid more? Because I come home with my head dragging off the floor and crying at night for these kids. And I get paid minimum wage. And if my husband were to die, I could not keep my house. And I am telling you, it is galling.
All right. So, real quick. What we are doing to education in this country is sinful. I use that word very purposefully. And it's economically stupid, sir. You're right. That's a technical term. I learned it in graduate school. It is stupid. But when we talk about professionals in school, gives them loan forgiveness programs as incentives and pays them fully what they're worth. Okay. The last question, then we're done. Last question, sir. Bring it home.
First of all, welcome to the Granite State Center.
Thank you very much. It is my second favorite new state. You can tell those New Yorkers that. Okay, so morals are not conveniences. They're not. If in this case, an ally has not only broken sort of moral, what I think are moral issues in the targeting and assassination of a journalist, but don't get anything started about what's happening in Yemen. And a war that has driven to the death of tens of thousands of children, which we were literally fueling the planes that were doing the bombing runs. This is unacceptable. We need to have our principles and our values, and they need to guide our foreign policy. Will we always be perfect? No, but we've got to call out the issues as they exist. And it can't just be us as citizens waiting for other people to call out the problems. We're Americans. When we have a chorus of conviction on these things, that's what we have to do. And this is why this has been two of the most hopeful years of my life. People are like, what? What do you mean 2 of the most hopeful years? Don't you know what happened 2 years ago? Let me explain why I am hopeful, and then we're done, and I will hopefully stop people from leaving and answer more individual questions. But I want everybody to understand this. What is hope? It is not this empty term. It is not. A woman on the 5th floor of the projects in Newark taught me what hope is. Her son was murdered in the lobby of the building I live. This wretched pain that no parent should have to face. In the 1980s, I moved into the buildings, found out what happened, asked her why she still lived there, and she said, why do I still live here? Miss Virginia Jones said to me, why am I still in apartment 5A? I go, yes. She goes, why am I still the tenant president of these buildings? I said, yes, Miss Jones, why? And she goes, because I'm in charge of Homeland Security. She was like that lawyer on a couch. She wasn't going to let her inability to do everything to undermine her determination to do something. She knows that no matter how wretched things get, how dark it is, that this is the real definition of hope. Hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. And there's been reasons to despair. A Muslim ban in our country. But when I went out to the airports and saw hundreds of Americans filling that area, chanting and cheering like Abraham welcoming strangers in the desert, I was like, this is hope. I told Joe Donnelly the same thing. He said, in Indianapolis, we went to our airports too, except for there were no international flights. We were just hugging people flying in from Detroit. This is a moment where we have a choice to make. We can choose hope over despair, love over hate, activism and engagement over apathy and cynicism. What will define this nation's future, yes, is who is the next president. But even more than that, it'll be Americans from coast to coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, standing up and saying, I am not waiting for hope. I am going to be an agent of hope, an agent of change. I am going to unleash the grace that this country needs. And the best example of this to me is one time that I indulged in despair. I admit it to everybody here. In January of 2017, I went to go hear an inaugural speech. And part of me was hoping that he would talk about something bold, like malice towards none and charity towards all. But I'm sorry, there was a whole lot of malice and very little charity. In fact, as George Bush was leaving, he turns to Bill Clinton, and it is said that he said to Bill Clinton, he said simply, that was some strange shit. I went home that night and I felt the siren call of despair. My mind was working hard. I had a headache. Oh my gosh, they're going to do what they said they were going to do and roll back protections for LGBTQ Americans. They're going to do what they said they were going to do and roll back environmental protections that are causing environmental injustice all over this country. They're going to roll back health care and pre-existing conditions. I went to bed being seduced by the call to despair. The next morning, as the good book says, weeping can endure through the night, but joy cometh in the morning. Well, for me, as I curled up in my bed the next morning, when I woke up, there was Miss Joneses across this country. Millions of women coming out and said, Cory, this is not a time to curl up, to give up, to shut up. It is a time to rise up, to stand up, to speak up, to be an agent of hope, to be an activist of love, to make sure that through our work and common sacrifice and common work that we make this nation rise.